I'm really excited to be joined today with a high-level panel to discuss the findings of a report that we're launching on this topic today. This is a really big moment for the climate agenda. We're talking in the week of the World Earth Summit happening tomorrow. And as we speak, the trialogue between EU institutions on the European climate law is in its final stages. So we're really very lucky to have the panelists that we do joining us today. We have with us in alphabetical order Edwin Bendick, joining us from Poland, the president of the board of the Stefan Batory Foundation, and Joan Groizard Payeras from Spain, the Director General of the Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Development. And we very much hope to be joined very shortly by Jytte Guteland, who's the lead climate negotiator for the European Parliament. I'm going to kick off before we hear from them with just a short presentation of the key findings of the report that we're launching at ECFR today. So just bear with me while I share my screen. So the piece of work that we've been doing is essentially to look at the national politics around the Green Deal. We know that the EU has nailed its colours to the mast at a public level in committing to the broad shape of the Green Deal and the broad level of ambition in terms of the timing and level of the transition goals. But much of the responsibility for the implementation lies at national level. So we carried out a survey of policymakers, thinkers and opinion shapers in all 27 of the EU's national capitals through our network of associate researchers at ECFR. In addition, we wanted to understand a little bit about what the public was thinking on the various different elements of the Green Deal. And so with Data Praxis and YouGov, we carried out a survey in November 2020, looking at the different elements of the Green Deal package and what the level of public support was for those things. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the reports which we're launching today, which brings this all together. Essentially, in order to know how to drive implementation forward, we felt it's very important to understand the starting point in terms of the different national perspectives. So we began by looking at where different member states are in terms of the energy transition. This first slide that you can see shows you the share of renewables in national energy mixes and also the speed at which member states have been developing their renewable sector. And what we can see here is quite a mixed picture on both of those elements, ranging from those who are quite far ahead in terms of the energy mix, Denmark, Finland and Sweden, and have been expanding quite rapidly their renewables sector in the last decade. Others, such as Latvia and Austria, moving more slowly, but starting from a relatively high base. And then a broader mix who are moving in the right direction at a slower pace. Interestingly, for us, from this starting point graph, was the fact that it's not, in fact, just the larger member states who are moving further and faster on this front, but leadership takes different forms within the EU. We then wanted to understand as well the question of energy efficiency and the extent to which member states are managing to achieve green growth. So what you can see on this second graph plots the various different member states in terms of the percentage change in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions against growth levels within the EU. And what we can see here is that 22 EU states have managed to achieve increased GDP at the same time as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But this is sort of at very different levels in terms of the achievements on both fronts. So we felt that perhaps these different starting points would help us to understand a little bit more the difference in perspectives across the member states as we move towards the implementation phase of the Green Deal. So in terms of the survey that we asked, one of the key questions for us, which helped us sort of really get into these perspectives, is when we asked what are the top 4 challenges or the top challenges that member states see in terms of the implementation of the Green Deal. And as you can see on this chart, the socioeconomic consequences and how to manage those was the biggest answer by quite a long way, with 19 member states arguing that this was an issue, or researchers identifying that from the interviews that were taking place there. But in addition, there's still significant levels of concern about other issues, including lack of political will at government level, lack of institutional capacity to absorb green transition funding and to take the measures forward, and also a significant amount of concern about industry opposition. Just to dwell a little bit on the geography of these 3 points, as you can see from the map, the need to mitigate the socioeconomic consequences of the transition is something that is a preoccupation all across the EU. But the other 2 large issues mapped here are actually more geographically focused, with political will from the government being more of a concern in Western and Central Europe, and the lack of capacity to use available funds being seen as much more significant in the south and east of the EU. Thinking then about the perceived risks, which is obviously a slightly different question from challenges, we can see here that the preoccupation with higher prices of energy and fuels is the highest one. But there is a strong, I think, sort of geopolitical element to a lot of these, and the top answers that came through here, including key industries being overtaken by greener foreign competitors, new energy dependencies and how to manage those as well as the kind of the socioeconomic dimension coming through again, how to manage declining living standards, and also the potential for political instability due to public discontent. Just sort of to stay on the geopolitical dimension here, when we asked about which other global actors' opinions mattered in climate action, the biggest answers by far were the US and China. But there was quite an interesting show of different answers to kind of second level. And this map shows you the extent to which Russia and Turkey are important, particularly in the south and east of the EU. And we found this quite interesting as well, because when we drilled into the question of what sort of are the geopolitical measures, what are the ways in which Europe can sort of begin to engage with managing the geopolitical consequences, there was a lot of concern about the prospect.
Okej, det har inte de. Då är det någonting.
The prospect of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and here it's clear that it's closer. It's the countries closer to Europe where there is more potential for Europe to actually influence behaviour and engage at an international level on the Green Deal. But this is not to say that member states don't see opportunities as well. And I do want to emphasise this point, that in the political surveys, there was a lot of focus too on the possibilities, the economic opportunities in modernising industry, in developing renewable energy sources and so on. So this is where we saw a real role for European states to work together, and for those who've been moving further and faster to share that best practice and experience and to pull others forward. Just to come quickly onto the question of public opinion, because we knew very clearly from both ECFR's public opinion surveying over the last few years, as well as that which other organisations have been doing, that climate is a hugely important issue in the public mindset. It's one of the key threats. It hasn't been replaced by COVID. By the issue of health security. Indeed, what we can see is that there's an increasing demand on governments to be prepared for the next crisis on climate as a result of COVID. And also importantly, climate is seen very much as an issue on which the European level is important, that there is a voice, a role for the European voice to play. So this is why we felt that it was important to dig into public opinion on the Green Deal. And what we found actually very much underpins the policy elite survey, in the sense that the biggest answer, the biggest support in all the member states that we covered in this survey was for measures around investing more in public transport systems. So this concern on the need to manage, to ensure fairness in the transition. The only two exceptions to this were the Netherlands and France, where the highest levels of support were actually for this idea of applying a tax on imported goods who had high levels of carbon in their production. So this is basically the carbon border adjustment mechanism in layman's terms, the way that we put it in the survey. So I will stop there, because I think that's enough data to throw at you at the beginning of the conversation, and just leave you with the idea that sort of from this this data set, we came away with three key conclusions in terms of how to drive a high level of ambition around the implementation of the Green Deal. Firstly, cooperation, coalition working. I've alluded to this already in our presentation, but it's important that to push ourselves beyond kind of implementing minimum standards within the member states, we see a real role for member states working together and driving each other forward in the areas where they have more experience. Secondly, it seems that in order to overcome the nervousness about the geopolitical consequences of the Green Deal, we should urgently develop a foreign policy strategy. So looking at how we manage the relationships that we're worried about in terms of the Green Deal. And then thirdly and finally, we can see from both the public opinion level and the elite surveys the importance of managing the socioeconomic impact. And so it's these kind of three ideas that I'm really looking forward to discussing with our panelists today in particular, in getting their reactions. I can see that Jytte Guteland has managed to join us, which is great news. Jytte, I introduced you earlier on as lead climate negotiator on behalf of the European Parliament. I was going to come to you first. Is that okay? Have you sort of heard sufficiently to feel able to react, or would you prefer that I went to the other panelists?
I can start, but maybe I can also come back sure. When I had the privilege to listen to the other panelists. Yes. But I can just say a few words if you like me. First of all, it's very timely to join your conversation here today, and thank you also for your report. It will be very valuable in the work in the European Parliament, not at least in the work in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I believe that the EU needs to increase the work with climate diplomacy. And I also believe that, of course, in the Committee for the International Trade, we will also need to increase the climate efforts in the trade relations. I'm very happy that you present this study now, as it's the also same day as we have agreed on a new climate law in the European Union. So I feel this is really a climate week. We had a climate law that was agreed provisionally 5 a.m. this morning after 14 hours of negotiations. So we had a night together. So if I look a little bit tired, it's because of that. It's not because of lack of interest, but it's because I'm feeling in my body that we had this negotiation. It was an important message to the world and to third countries, I believe, that the European Union is committed to do more, to increase the effort to 2030, I would say at least 55, but there is also a promise that we will come to 57 with increased net target and the removals that we will increase in the LULUCF's legislation. We also made sure that we are more ambitious than the original proposal on the reduction to 2030, because we make sure that there is no loophole that was actually the case in the original proposal that the removals could mean. We do more to put the EU in and the climate law in line with science. So we have a greenhouse gas budget that will be important for the target target to 2040. That is not also a new intermediate target for the European Union that I also believe will be important on the trajectory towards climate neutrality. We also introduced advisory board with independent experts that will evaluate the climate policy and both in relation to the climate law, but also Paris Agreement. And all that said, I believe it's an important message to all the countries in the world that the European Union is doing more. And to be able to be effective in the climate diplomacy, but also in the trade relations, we need to work with ourselves because that's the best message. So it's a foundation that we actually did more today. It's not enough, but it's more, and it's a very good message. I also believe that the EU-US summit this week is important, and that's a motivator for why we worked so hard to conclude the climate law. And together with the US, now when we have the president who promised to deliver on climate and stay in the Paris Agreement, we can do much more for Glasgow than we did in Madrid last time. And on the in that relation, your report will be very valuable also to see how EU can be of big help also in relation to the countries who will participate in Glasgow. I will stop that now and then listen and then maybe come back if you would like me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for your comments. And indeed, I may well ask you if we could go in a little bit more detail to the EU-US relationship around all this later on in the conversation. But I'd like to turn now to our second speaker, to Joan Groizard Payeras. You've heard in the comments so far this idea of coalition working for member states together. We've identified in the report a lot of dynamism in Spain around the renewables sector, and this being a sort of a possible area where we could look to more leadership from Spain. I'm interested in your sense of whether this chimes with the role that you see for Spain in implementing the Green Deal, and whether this is the kind of role that you'd relish. So please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Susi. And first of all, thank you to ECFR, obviously, for counting on us for today's discussion, but also for the report. I think it's useful material for us to, and especially coinciding with negotiations for the European climate law, to take stock on where we all are, what the perceptions are of where we all are, and what the challenges are going ahead. So obviously for Spain, the climate agenda is key, and I think that's clear, and I think that's known. We are lucky to have a ministry for the ecological transition, which tries to make it very visible what we feel about our climate targets. This ministry has now been raised to the rank of a vice presidency. I'm very privileged to be working in Minister Ribera's team in this vice presidency. And for us, in fact, this priority for climate policy has been embedded in our recovery and resilience plan, which, as you know, as other member states, we are currently finalizing. And in fact, the title of our national plan is the Recovery, Resilience and Transformation Plan. For us, the plan is very much about transforming our economic system, our productive system, towards the ecological transition and climate, as not as another sectorial policy, but as something that sort of embeds the entirety of Spain's economic policy. And for that's very, very important. Thinking about the report, and I had the chance to have a look at a few of the numbers, I think it's fair to say, and we should be open about this, that in the last decade, the previous decade, Spain wasted some time. I am in love with the city of Brussels, but it pains me to say that for some years, it was reported that Spain, a country with a lot of sunshine, as you might imagine, invested less in solar power than the region of Brussels in Belgium for a few years. I think that's representative of some of the time we wasted. And I think that reflects on some of the numbers. So from a quantitative perspective, we are probably behind other colleagues in other member states compared to where we would feel comfortable or we would like to be. And I think it's important to analyze the causes of that and to use that to work from. Having said that, I think we've been catching up, or we have tried certainly to catch up in the last few years. For us, it was very important to participate in the agreement of the existing 2030 climate targets. The Spain, I think it's fair to say, was relevant in achieving the targets that we have today, in the books. And obviously, our role or our ambition is to contribute to an increased ambition at the European level. I think currently our NECP, our National Energy and Climate Plan, is already. We might have to fine tune it to be 55 fit for 55, but we are very close. We are certainly above what is sort of expected from us in a 40% target for 2030. So I think we're almost there. And so obviously as a country, we're very, very comfortable with increasing European ambition. And I think it's important for us to do that. Moving from maybe targets to specific policies or specific facts and sort of linking into some of the issues you raised. Spain is seeing one of the fastest phase out of coal power generation in Europe. By 2022, we expect almost all of our coal power capacity to be totally shut down. And that is being done with a relative social peace. For us, the just transition strategy was a key part of our in fact, our NECP was sort of published at the same time as the just transition strategy. And we're working extremely hard with obviously workers' unions, with the companies, with the regions, with the municipalities to ensure we have alternatives to the coal power plants in communities where for the last 40 years, that was the main source of employment, the main source of income for that region. So making sure that the energy transition is not seen as sort of something that comes from the outside, is imposed on these regions and kicks people out of their livelihood, but actually gives an opportunity. That's something that we're investing a lot of time and a lot of effort in, because that for us, that will be the difference between it being credible, it being legitimate, or it being something that will not fly from a political perspective. So that's important. And we're trying to innovate from a policy point of view here. For example, just as an example, when you shut down a coal power plant, the grid connection capacity, so that is left free because of the coal shutdown, we are not just giving that to the first company that comes to connect a new project, but we're actually making up some sort of competition to give that to the best project from a social, employment, economic, and environmental perspective. So we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of debate at the local level for interesting projects in those regions. And that's just one example of the things we're working on. In terms of dynamism and renewables you mentioned, we're focusing on I think both ends of the spectrum. So starting at the small level, for us, self-consumption, so distributed generation is important. So making sure that anywhere from a household or a local community can generate their own energy, all the way to large scale. Obviously, we have a significant amount of land and resource in Spain. So our policy is focusing on both of those areas, and we're seeing both sort of conventional utilities, conventional companies growing in both areas, but also new startups, new enterprises, sort of traditional electricians basically innovating and joining the renewable energy sector as a sector for growth. So we're seeing sort of small, medium, and large companies interested in this, and we're keen to keep that going. And from a social perspective, I think we're lucky to say that broadly there's this broad consensus. We're finalizing our national energy and climate law as well. We do have one party in parliament which is openly denialist about climate change. but fortunately they don't seem to have much traction in Spanish society. I think Spanish society, in all perspectives, is very mature about this, and we've got a lot to go. Obviously, and just to finish off, because I'm keen to listen to the rest of the interventions. We can't do this alone, and I think that's very obvious and it's very clear. Cooperation is obviously key. Some cooperation for us is sort of cross-border and sort of a physical cooperation, and by this I mean, as you know, the Iberian Peninsula is an almost energy island compared to the rest of Europe. And so we currently have a limited interconnection capacity from an electricity perspective. And that means that Portuguese, Spanish, but also, you know, French and consumers from all of the EU are not being able to take the most advantage of cheap, competitive, renewable electricity whenever that is generated. So I think very immediate, very local, very regional cross-border cooperation for us is absolutely key on that level, but also obviously broader cooperation with the rest of our European colleagues. And we're thinking things like innovation in hydrogen. There's a debate in Europe about the colors of hydrogen, and that basically refers to what origin the hydrogen is. For us, Spain very much advocates for green hydrogen only, so hydrogen exclusively from renewable sources, because we think that's what's compatible with that photo of net zero, of climate neutrality. But there's a lot to do in terms of value chain, in terms of technology from a European level, so cooperation there is important. Another example is offshore wind. Europe has been a leader in offshore wind in the North Sea, where we have a geographical sort of accident of very shallow waters. So that means that offshore wind has been able to grow very quickly. But if we want offshore wind to grow to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, we need to invest in new technologies like floating technology, so literally floating wind turbines. That's something that Spain, with a big wind sector and a big shipping maritime sector, is something that I think from a technological perspective we can contribute to. So, you know, it's the sort of things we think are useful. Finally, from an ambition perspective, I think EU rules give us at least the idea of a level playing field, but I think it's important that no member state perceives that the energy transition is at their expense. So, you know, if we're talking about the automotive industry, for example, you know, our neighbors from France, our neighbors from Germany or Italy, they are very big vehicle manufacturers. If we perceive that somehow the energy transition means something to do with winners and losers, that is going to be very difficult for the internal geopolitics of the energy transition. So we need to make sure that we can all move at the same level. And from a foreign policy perspective, looking beyond Europe's borders, indeed, the Biden administration is very good news. We've also learned that, you know, Europe needs to be able to stand on its own feet from an international perspective, because, you know, our colleagues from the other side of the Atlantic, they're there hopefully most of the time, but, you know, sometimes all sorts of things happen. So, you know, we need to be solid in this. And, you know, it's not my field of expertise, but I know my colleagues in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Spain, they are working on an sort of cross-sectional foreign policy strategy where things like gender, things like climate are very, very important parts of Spain and I believe the broader European foreign policy. So those are some of the messages I wanted to put forward, but very keen to continue the discussion.
Thank you. There's a lot there that I'm sure we'll want to come back to in the discussion. But before we move into discussion mode, I'd just like to turn now to our third panelist, Edwin Bendick. You're joining us from Poland. I wondered if I could ask you, I mean, Poland is obviously one of the countries with quite a big challenge on its hands in terms of managing the socioeconomic consequences, quite a long way to go in the transition away from dependence on carbon. I wondered if you could give us a few thoughts on what you think is needed to manage that process, both economically and politically.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting to this conversation, and let me start with congratulations to join with joining. Congratulations for your work and for your report, which is really fine and well resonated with my knowledge and intuitions. And you well showed the complexity of the problem of green transformation and all these issues concerning transition. And what I'd like to stress and to show is the risk or risks connected to this process, because I think I'd like to show that what we treat as a common goal of green transformation can translate in some circumstances into some kind of a common enemy for the new wave of populist forces and populist politics fueled with the fear of change and all these negative issues or impacts you showed in your report, like higher cost of living, higher cost of energy, and so on. And Poland is a good example to show these risks, because obviously we are not in the avant-garde of the change. We are rather a break for the process. We are the only country in Europe or European Union who haven't yet acknowledged the climate neutrality as a national goal. So we still believe that we can persuade European Union that, so we accept climate neutrality and European Green Deal, but we try to persuade that this climate neutrality should be a common goal for European Union, shared between countries. And Poland, because of its dependence on coal, we still obtain almost 70% of electricity from burning coal and lignite. So we believe that we have the biggest problem within this area. But on the other hand, we still don't have a consistent policy in this area. When you listen to our politicians, you can hear different things. For example, Polish president was talking about let's say, about coal as a source of Polish energy security, and it was just 2 years ago in Katowice during United Nations Climate Summit. But on the other hand, the same government began negotiations with miners about closing the mining industry in Poland. And this process should end in the first half of this century. So there are discrepancies between these claims. When you look at the newest energy strategy of the Polish government, you cannot find any correspondence between the strategy and climate neutrality goals of European Union. So we don't know what is the game or what is the real, let's say, real political will. And perhaps we have get used to this situation and to follow the processes which are inside society and look at the societal level, because Polish political forces are they are simply opportunists. They are following forces which emerge inside or on the level of society. And when we look at this from this perspective, then we can see several issues which add to the complexity of the problem. The first thing, and we should have remember our history, but I don't want to talk about the brave history of Polish fight against communist regime, but about other aspect of it. So we used to be an ecological society in the end of communist age. Poland was one of the dirtiest countries in the world at that time, and we were on the edge of ecological apocalypse. And so ecology was a very political issue in Poland. It was part of the negotiations between opposition and communists in the end of 80s. So the famous round table between opposition and government had its sub-table, which was about ecology. And it was very important, according to sociological studies from this time. Almost 3/4 of Poles were a very poor society at the time. Almost 3/4 of us were ready to cut our salaries to support environment. But all this changed within the next decade. So in 2016, a very small minority cared for climate and ecology. Something has changed in 2 years later because of sudden discovery of the issue of air pollution. So in 2017, a huge cloud of smog covered Warsaw, capital of Poland, and then national media and politicians discovered the issue and made it political. And since then, we are talking about ecology, we are talking about dirty air, and we join the issue of air quality to climate and so on. So because of that, the pace of development of political discourse concerning climate change is faster now. But then pandemic changed this and once again changed our priorities. So we recognize the issue of the climate, but because of pandemic, personal attitude has changed. And we can refer to the last study done by sociologists from the Warsaw University, who shows that something strange happened inside our society. So the experience of pandemic made this ecological consciousness even stronger than it used to be earlier on. But on the other hand, people ask about their preferences, about their will to accept restrictions or other harsh measures needed to fight climate change. They answer no, we don't want to do this. We won't sacrifice our personal freedom, mobility, lifestyles to change the issue. So, and it's very strong, let's say, embedded in, especially among members of younger generation. So it's against.
But this is a really interesting point, and I'd like to dig into it maybe with you and the other panelists. That I suppose politically there is a risk as we come out of this crisis. The consensus around the need for green action as we move into the implementation phase, and it does indeed become about personal or sacrifices for the industry, changes that we're making at national level, that the whole sort of question of green politics becomes more difficult in a sense. And I'm interested in your views about how we ensure that the implementation of the Green Deal doesn't become the sort of the next battleground of imposition by Brussels on member states, and that we take the green public consensus with us over the coming months and years through this difficult period. Maybe I could put that question to Guteland. What's your sense on this? Where does the balance lie in terms of achieving that? I'd also encourage anybody else to, if they have other questions they want to put to the panelists, to put those in the chat box, and I can pick those up too. Sorry, Jytte.
I think the balance must be there, so that both the member state has the freedom to choose their pathway and how they will in many times work with climate policy when it comes to the tools. But the EU level has a very important role in the target setting, in making sure that we all have an ambition that will deliver on the global scale. And I believe that it is the EU level that can actually achieve that and help us not have this competition between each other, where we actually destroy our common interest to work together, because the planet needs us to work together. And that goes also for our industry, of course, and for the sectors, that if we don't have a common level playing field, then we will definitely hinder each other instead of helping each other. That said, in the report, in the study, I believe it was important what's on the conclusions that the member states are not two different camps that is fighting each other. They have different obstacles, they have different opportunities, they are ready to do different things. So that gives us, this is also my impression in the climate policy lawmaking in the European Parliament, that you cannot say that member state will be against that and against the same as the others who also is a bit having a longer pathway to climate neutrality, because there can be things that differs. And I think that's optimistic. That's something that we can work on. That's something that helps the way to work together. And I also shared a picture that the socioeconomic challenge, such as prospect of rising unemployment by the closure of carbon-intensive industries is very important, of course. But there I need to say, and that's also my political family's view, that it will be very dependent on how much we work on the just transition to do this in a way where we help each other, where we give economic incentives, but also where we help workers in the who might need the new education, new opportunities to take new jobs in the future. That is a very important tool if we shall do this in an ambitious way, and I'm very happy that that was also addressed in the study. And I really think that is a key. If we don't want to end up having this yellow West movement that France had, then that's the key. And that's also the key to deliver the climate ambition, that we address the socio-economic impact this transition has. My last message on that is that we shall not be so problem-oriented that we forget to see the opportunities that is beyond the corner for all of us, also those who have more to do, because it will be a future with better jobs, more jobs for Europe, better technology, also for health. I'm very happy that Edwin raised that aspect. The health impact is also very important. Many of the climate tools is also tools to prevent the pollution in the bigger cities that is affecting the public health. And we need to also talk about that. Otherwise, we will be too problem-oriented, and that will stop us from the ambition that we need to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joan, Edwin, Jytte has drawn attention to the Just Transition Fund, and we actually also have a question in the chat box from Eva Mineur about whether or not the Just Transition Fund will be sufficient to manage the socioeconomic consequences. There have certainly been some criticisms about the time that these things are sort of taking to come online and so on in the national settings. I'd be interested in your perspectives on that. Joan, would you like to? Yeah.
Fantastic. So I think obviously the Just Transition Fund is a very important tool, and I think it recognizes or proves that just the fact that the ecological transition has to be a fair one, a just one, is reflected and is taken into account at the European level, and I think that's extremely important. But at the same time, I think we can't assume, or we can't say that the Just Transition Fund is all there is to do when you talk about a just transition. I think member states within their capabilities, within their budget possibilities, need to incorporate that fairness, that just element of the transition into their policies, and even the sort of cost neutral measures that you might be able to do when you take into account how you distribute those efforts, or where you direct investments, or if you have some sort of tax or fiscal policy, make sure you figure out sort of who you're targeting and why. So I think being able to make just transition something cross-sectional across, I would say, energy policy, but actually climate policy or sort of green policy as a whole, I think it's probably very, very important. Also because the scope probably changes depending on when you ask the question. So we're looking very specifically at, for example, coal phase out, which is something sort of closer in time, but we will see things such as, I mentioned the automotive industry earlier. That's a big industry in Europe, and that needs to face an important transformation if we are to meet our targets, not only overall, but specifically to do with vehicles. So how do you ensure that those jobs and those skills are taken care of, and so on. So Is it enough? It's, that probably corresponds to some higher level of discussion. Should we be doing more? Certainly. And that means money, but that also means designing policies carefully to take into account the just transition in a broad way.
Yes, I agree
Thank you,
that
Edwin.
oh, sorry.
Please.
So I fully agree that just transition mechanism, just transition fund is crucial to address this problem of transformation. As I know, it was Mr. Buzek who offered this instrument in Katowice 2 years ago. So we are strongly supporting this idea, but we also have to understand that it's not enough to have good practical or let's say technocratic tools to address these problems. We have also to admit that there are some other issues we have to address. I call them the problem of double void. So the first void is a void of ignorance. So we are, and you are also referring to some public opinion polls showing that this consciousness of the problem is going up. But on the other hand, when we look more carefully to different studies, we can find, for example, that in Poland, on 50% of Poles don't know what climate neutrality is, and only 10% can say a little bit what it means. And the situation in France is not much better. Only 20% of Frenchmen know and or declare that they know what climate neutrality is. So this 90% of ignorance is a huge void which can be filled with some political forces. And I am afraid that populists are the best or the most skillful agents to do this. And the second part or the second aspect of this void is communicational void. So looking at that studies on public discourse concerning European Green Deal done by Counterpoint think tank from London, so we can see that message from Brussels doesn't reach beyond the inner circle of experts. It goes further to mass audience, and the same is with the messages of climate activists and so on. So once again, there is a huge void in the field of communication, which once again can be filled by somebody. So we have to do something with these aspects, and it's not so easy, of course, because it's not easy to rely on simple liberal tools like improving ecological education in schools. We don't have time for this to improve ecological education. So we have to keep in mind these aspects, and how to do this, I really don't know. So I try to do on my best as a journalist. But I know that it's enough. I am hopefully looking at the very fact that debate around these issues are now getting hotter in Poland, and in good sense hotter. That a lot of different, let's say, groups, different interest groups is joining this process, and we are beginning to talk in a very, let's say, interesting way these problems.
Thank you very much. I want to move for the final section of our conversation onto the geopolitical dimension. We've had a question in the chat box from Jaap Werner on what a foreign policy strategy should look like, and sort of what the balance should be between carrots and sticks, conditionality in engagement, the role of a carbon border adjustment mechanism versus aid being sort of targeted on countries who are serious about projects supporting the green transition. I have my views on this, which is that it's the sort of the effective design of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is one of our biggest chances, I think, to have a real influence on the behaviour of other global players. And that, you know, what we could see very clearly in the thinking in our surveys was the need for the design of that tool to be compatible with international trade rules, and for it to be clear that this is not at odds with Europe's ongoing ambition to champion free and fair trade, but rather it is a tool designed to push us all further and faster on the transition front. But I'm interested in the views of the panelists on this dimension, and specifically, Jytte, you referred us to the EU-US summit and the importance of the transatlantic relationship. Do you see specific areas where EU-US cooperation could go further and deeper, sort of beyond the narrative on international action?
First of all, if I could also answer the more the geopolitical risks and that part of your study. I also have heard this, so this is a serious concern, of course, but I think it's very important to point out that there is nothing risk that is free from risk, and standing still is actually the most risky position. So if you would like to take a global leadership, if you like your to protect your future, we need to keep walking, and that's the message that we need to have on the EU level, that for the jobs of Europe, for the competition, for the leadership, also when it comes to our labor market and the economy, we need to walk to the future. And there was the biggest trade union leader in Sweden a couple of years back said that people talk about the risk of the new times and the new jobs and the new technology, and he said he sees nothing more risky than the old jobs. And I think we need to have a kind of that mentality too, but without being ignorant to the fact that this is a fear that can be relevant for some and that will hit some, because there is of course always the balance what we are pushing for in the European Union, and we also have of course the competition where there can be countries who doesn't have a fair competition, that actually put subsidies or kind of not market-based competition, but actually use the state to support all jobs, and that is something that is a competition for Europe. So I see the CBAM as a tool that can be used to protect climate. That is not for having subsidies for our industry, but it's to protect climate and ensure that we have a level playing field. And it should be in compliance with the World Trade Organization. And I believe it's possible to do that. I see that this could be, as well as the trade agreements, a way of making sure that we also take a global leadership on this question, that we need a chain in the trade that is in compliance with the Paris Agreement. So I see that as a way of doing it. It's one tool. It will be highly difficult. It will be very discussed. I'm very interested what the Commission will present this summer. We already had our own initiative report on this from the Parliament. We didn't take stand on if we should have work with a similar ETS way of doing it, or if we should have some kind of tax or something like that, but we have worked with it, and it will be very important what will come out this summer. And then on the US, very short, I know I took some time here, I will just say that yes, there is room for leadership on several points, of course on the NDCs, that we deliver on our commitments, both in the US and in the EU in front of Glasgow, and have higher ambition there, but also to take on the climate in relation to third countries, that we are willing to finance what's needed in the climate transition, and that there is a way of doing that is in solidarity with countries who rightly thinks that the US and the EU has emitted enormously during decades, and that they should stand for bigger climate financing than they are doing today. So that's really important. And then also, lastly, I think we should have an ETS system in the US that would be similar to what's in the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Very concrete ideas. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give 2 minutes to each of our remaining panelists on any aspects of this sort of geopolitical picture that you want to dig into. And if you feel brave, we've also got 2 questions in the chat box about whether or not nuclear energy and natural gas should be part of the transition mix as well. So just to make the challenge even harder. Who wants to go first? Edwin, should we come to you first this time?
Okay. So first, let me ask, just to bring 2 short comments concerning Europe and United States, and it's great that United States have rejoined the program and tries to be a leader of this process. But we have to recognize that it's not only about cooperation, it will be also about competition. So we have to understand and to well define our European position in this competition. So because issue of new technology will be crucial one, and it won't be only a sphere of let's say friendship. So I am afraid. And the second comment concerns CBAM mechanism, and I believe it's a great idea, but for Poland, who is a border country and with strong relationship to countries like Ukraine, so it's a very tough issue. We have to deal with it very carefully, how to not alienate countries like Ukraine from the game. So we need to consider carefully how to implement this tool. And finally, when we are talking about nuclear, so we in Poland believe that this is part of the solution, but however, we don't have any nuclear power for the moment in Poland, but we believe that we should invest in new reactors, but I am afraid we won't build them. But however, this is a topic for political discourse, and much more real is transfer from coal to green energy through natural gas. Yes, this is the real part of the game.
Thank you very much. So Joan, you have the last word.
So not easy after my colleagues. So quickly on the international perspective, maybe just 3 messages there. I think the EU has proven that having a high standard as a market power, as a significant market to sell to, it helps to increase standards worldwide to providers who wish to sell in this market. And I think that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is one way of making that very specific and very concrete when it comes to carbon footprint. I think it's also a tool to provide, well, to regain maybe some legitimacy internally. So when workers of the steel sector, for example, or other carbon intensive sectors feel that they are at an unfair competition with international, when participating in international markets, a properly designed carbon border mechanism will help reintroduce the idea of fairness here, that indeed we have this level playing field, not just within the EU, but globally. And I think maybe something that from a personal perspective, I think it's important to build on is how do we monitor the effective carbon leakage? So how much of our decarbonization is actual decarbonization and how much is delocalization of those emissions somewhere else? If we just delocalize and then just pay for it, well, that's sort of equivalent to compensating or paying back those. We need to ensure that the overall emissions that we are responsible for, whether domestically or because of imported goods, that actually contributes to that reduction. And depending on how you design that mechanism, then if you have a sort of cap that goes reducing, then you can do that. And then maybe 30 seconds on gas and nuclear. I think for me the key is, what is the most effective way of reaching decarbonization? And for me, that is, what is the combination of the fastest and the cheapest way of achieving decarbonization, which also does not lock you into things that you don't want to be locked into. So, and maybe this is very specific to a Spanish context, but we can certainly install renewables a lot faster and a lot cheaper than we can do nuclear, even if you get, even without getting into the what do you do with waste and sort of legacy and so on. So just from a very practical, what is my fastest way of getting the megawatts on the ground and running? And in terms of gas, especially with my worry there would be with lock-in. We are seeing very low prices for electricity in wholesale markets because of increasing penetration of renewables. So how long is it going to take to recover any investments in gas? And so are we going to find ourselves in 2050? It's 2021. How long does it take to pay back for new investments in gas? Are we still going to have to be paying back investments in gas in 30 years' time when we want to be carbon neutral? So those would be sort of the big things to think about when considering which technologies are key.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all three of you for your not just your participation but your energy and your insights in such a busy week. We really appreciate it. We've discussed an awful lot, but there's a lot more to continue in the conversation. So hopefully we can stay in touch as the Commission proposals come forward and this agenda drives forward over the coming weeks. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's participated too. Apologies if your question didn't get asked, but thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.